Andrew, what jobs are there with bears in Minnesota, in captivity and in the wild?
Sure. So it's a very limited job market, as you might imagine. I work for a state agency, and we have two biologists that work for bears for the whole state on wild bears. There are a few university positions that we've collaborated with on bears over the years, but in general, there's two for the whole state. On the captive side, we have two zoos within the state of Minnesota that are accredited by the ACA. And so there's a couple zookeeper positions there. But in general, if you want to do hands-on research on bears, it's generally with a state agency.
And Andrew, what do you do, please?
Sure. So my role is the Bear Project leader for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And so what that means is I am in charge of providing research information to our agency to make management decisions about bear populations. Typically, we manage bears through highly regulated hunting. And so you need to know, how bears are surviving, how they're reproducing, where they go, what they do, what they eat, that sort of thing. And provide that information to management. So that's my role. And then the agency makes decisions about hunter harvest allocation and that sort of thing. And then the other information we work on is how to minimize human bear conflict. Around the world, human bear conflict is kind of a big deal, no matter where you go if you work on bears. And so having a good handle on how to keep attractants secured and work with people to minimize bear issues can help that coexistence with bears in general.
I imagine it's seen as a pretty cool job, your job.
Yeah, it's routinely I will say I have one of the best jobs in the DNR. Not to besmirch the colleagues that I work with. There's a lot of colleagues in DNR that do really important work and are wonderful, but um, selfishly, I think I have one of the best jobs in the DNR without question.
Andrew, do you do it for the personal satisfaction, professional recognition, or the money?
Certainly not the money. I think anybody getting into wildlife conservation knows this is a um, experience-rich but financially poor job. Certainly, this position provides enough salary to make a comfortable living. Um, but my husband still has to work. It's not enough to support a full family on without two incomes. But that's just society today. Uh, it's more about the feeling like you're making a difference in applied conservation and management of a species. What I do directly impacts the overall bear population for the state. And it's one small piece that I can have to try to make the world a little better place for at least the bears and ecology in general.
Andrew, how did your career develop?
Sure. So I actually wanted to be a fisheries biologist when I first started at university, and I could not pass organic chemistry. I took it three times. It was not my deal. So I switched to wildlife and had some good experiences working on waterfowl and small critters, but bears had always been a passion. However, finding your way into the door into working with large mammals is kind of tricky, especially bears. Carnivores, it's pretty much all the same. There's not a lot of opportunity for the amount of demand that people would like to work in these jobs. So I ended up working on a master's degree on bobwhite quail in southern Texas and connected with a bear biologist who was working in northern Mexico at the time. and volunteered some time to help her coordinate a meeting and help her get some data analyzed and some publications out the door. And then that was enabled me to leverage her network of bear biologists, which got me in touch with my former supervisor. I volunteered for him trapping bears for a summer for a research project in northwestern Minnesota, and then went back for a PhD working on urban bears, and just lucked out that a position in my home state it was available at the time, and I lucked out that I made it all the way through the interview and ended up in the position that I have. So it was kind of a winding road, and I would say for people that are looking to get into conservation, um, the probability of you starting in the same place in your home province, state, jurisdiction without having to travel is very low. And you have to just travel to find the jobs. There are people from all over the world traveling to work on bears. I have colleagues that have come to the US from Japan, from the Netherlands, from the UK, all over the place. And they get their experiences and then they go back home and can work on things. Similar, we go abroad. There are a number of colleagues I have that have worked in Scandinavia, perhaps on different critters, and then come back, brought that knowledge back, and now are working on the species they want to, nearer to home. So lots of traveling involved just to get that experience and kind of build that network first before you end up where you want to be.
Oh, that's really interesting. Andrew, if you had to put out a job advertisement for the job that you do, uh, what skills would you emphasize in the advertisement?
Sure. The main one that is gonna send you up and over the top is an ability to have fairly advanced statistical and quantitative knowledge. One of my roles is to estimate the bear population, which uses fairly complex modeling and a bunch of different pieces of disparate data to kind of unify it and summarize it in a one piece. It took me a while to learn that. Math wasn't my strong suit to start, but that's kind of how you make it today. It's changed dramatically from the last, 20, 30 years ago. Um, Conflict management skills are very important. De-escalation training is helpful to just kind of diffuse and have a calm, semi-rational discussion with people that are kind of upset the way that your government might be managing things, and you're the face of the government that they're interacting with. Um, Similarly, an ability to tolerate really harsh field conditions. We're out at I think the coldest we've gone out was something like a wind chill of minus 40 Fahrenheit. And when you get that cold, it's about the same as minus 40 C. So it's awful cold. And you got to be able to tolerate that, to keep a positive mindset and deal with that sort of thing. In the summertime, we're dealing with biting flies, biting mosquitoes. You're covered in, bear fluids, when they're in the trap. It's not a clean deal. And so just being able to tolerate a wide variety of conditions and situations is really helpful. Um, and then the last one, and I think is probably as important as any of the others, is being able to communicate. That's both orally, to be able to take a fairly complex topic and break it down into very simple lay terms, as well as being able to write both for a lay audience. And then technically, the currency of wildlife biology and most science is published papers, and technical reports. We're required to, for all of our funding, we have to do annual reports and that sort of thing. So being able to clearly convey your thoughts in writing is really quite important, and I think sometimes gets um, perhaps overlooked in some of the educational institutions here in the US, just because they're trying to cram all this knowledge and technical stuff all in a very short 4-year window for an undergraduate degree.
How do people acquire these skills?
Sure. So there's a couple ways to do it. Formal coursework is really helpful to have those foundational skills, and most universities here in the United States in natural resources program will have some sort of conflict management coursework, and you'll go through um, some fairly large, fairly complicated, or what's the word? sticky issues, I think is the way that these are sometimes described, like perhaps delisting grizzly bears in the United States off of the endangered species list, or dealing with um, bison management and cattle producers, or a UK example might be the conflict of badgers and cattle producers, that sort of thing. And you try to come at it from both sides, um, and learn all the intricacies as much as you can to understand not only the perspectives of the different parties and stakeholders, but how maybe to navigate some of those tricky things. In general, it's often nuance, and there's core principles that people have that they're passionate about. But in general, you can still be respectfully disagree, and have that sort of discourse without delving into some rather without things getting maybe so heated, and then letting some of the heat dissipate. The on-the-job experience is also helpful. We live in our communities. We are, anytime I'm out and about, um, start bears come up, and they'll often either berate, DNR's doing a terrible job of management, or like, oh, hey, you're the bear guy. We went out with you on a bear den or something a few years ago. And so like we have to live and work in these communities. And so sometimes people come in real hot, and it just is a slow acquiring of living life and experience and being in some of these difficult situations.
Wow, fascinating. Really fascinating. Um, On to interview technique, Andrew. And how can interns and volunteers prepare for an interview?
Sure. It kind of depends on the job. If you're more looking for a educational position or a research style position, reaching out ahead of time to find out what type of research that they're working on is helpful to get a feeling for the overall personality and the vibes of the lab in which you're planning to work in. In general, cold contact is a really awkward way of doing that, just straight reaching out to the researchers or not. But many researchers have these lab web pages, and they often will have a thing about prospective students or prospective applicants for these sort of jobs about what to consider, that sort of thing. It's really awkward, but if you find when you're reading the literature about some cool research you want to maybe work on or some sort of similar style, um, that's like a base talking point that you can say, hey, I read your paper in XYZ. I really liked it. This is a little bit about me, and that sort of melts the ice. And you can say, oh, well, hey, I don't have any opportunities now, but my colleague has worked on something similar. They are looking for a job. And often it's much easier to find those positions that are already available and funded in research assistantships, that sort of thing, than it is to try to come up with a unique on your own research project, then get the funding. It's not certainly not impossible, but it's much more complicated. On the government side, we have very structured interviews, and so these are very rote, scripted interviews where you are looking to meet some sort of characteristics on a rubric based on those position descriptions. And so paying very, very close attention to what's in the advertisement for minimum and preferred qualifications, and making sure not only your resume, but your cover letter addresses all of those points. And then if you're lucky to get an interview, making sure that you can relate those back to that position description will help anchor your application and often allow you to be the best scoring. In general, people who get into the sciences are um, often introverted, myself included. And so sometimes we don't like to talk about our accomplishments. And those, unfortunately, that's the time where you need to talk about, like, hey, I was able to anesthetize and collar, 30 whatever, 30 squirrels and get them collared and track them around my university or whatnot. And those sort of like real world examples showing how you can, um, how you technically are able to do the job, and then just a general way to convey your overall personality is a really helpful thing. When we're looking for people, we're always looking for people who are good collaborators, who are willing to communicate proactively and be very collegial. We have a very small research group here. It's only 8 people for basically all of the forested wildlife species in the whole state that are hunted or trapped. And because it's so tight knit, one harsh personality sometimes can spoil the bunch. And so we're trying to make sure that you'd vibe well and fit with the overall group.
Andrew, what's your most treasured possession in your black bear field kit?
Well, um, this is a funny story. It's ironic because I stand on the shoulders of giants. So my predecessor started the Bear Project in 1983. We are still using the same tackle box and kit that we have in 1983. It is cobbled together with tape and wire and hardware cloth. Um, but within that kit, the most treasured possession is probably either the old wooden screwdriver that I have put together multiple times, the handle's falling off, but I just can't bring myself to get rid of it, um, or the tooth elevator. And so this is a specific piece of dental equipment that it has like a screwdriver handle, but a very long, narrow scoop, and it's used to extract the first premolar of bears. We do this while they're under full anesthesia, just like general surgery. But life would we use these teeth for everything. Age, you can determine reproduction, looking at the annuli within the teeth. You section them and look for thin and thick spaces like tree rings. And so you can find cub years in the thin years because they're lactating and using a lot of energy to feed the cubs. And then in thick years is just mom and the yearlings. And so without those teeth, we can't do our job. And the most important thing by far is that tooth elevator. And I tell you, if I would lose that, I would certainly cry. You can order new ones, but like I have you been using the same one since 2010, and it's an old friend for sure.
Andrew, how would you describe black bear conservation in Minnesota today?
We're in a very good place. Historically, as with many states and many countries, there was a very organized campaign to remove predator species off the landscape as much as possible to foster settlement and agriculture. Minnesota is no exception to this at all. Our state, nearly all the trees were cut for logging around the turn of the 19th century. That pretty much all the trees were gone. Certainly by the 1920s, all the old growth pretty much was gone. And so the forests we have today are a relic of that cutting. Similarly, around that time, that's when settlement was happening. Statehood was in the early 1800s. And so around that time, people were setting up farms and having bears raid their crops and that sort of thing. Bears and corn has been a perpetual issue since the domestication of maize, I would say. There was a concerted effort by the government, both federal and state, to reduce bear populations as much as possible. The federal government hired trappers that wide-scale poisoned wolves, coyotes, bears across the country. Um, and then there was a shift in the 1930s to that conservation mindset a bit. Aldo Leopold wrote a Sand County Almanac and established the other book was Game Management, which is kind of the start of our wildlife profession. Um, and that sort of allowed things to sort of switch. There's a really famous essay in that book called um, Thinking Like a Mountain, um, and another one called Escadilla. And both of those are about Aldo Leopold as a young man who was sent out to the Gila wilderness in New Mexico. Um, how his job was to kill wolves, and he watched the famous quote is he watched the fierce green fire in an old wolf's eyes die as he approached, and that it was supposed to create this abundance of game for hunters and for food, but something felt core wrong about that. And so after the 30s, we had this on again, off again protection situation with bears where they were a bounty species up until the mid 1960s, where the government would, county governments would pay people to kill bears. Um, and that stopped, the last bounty fell in 65. After that, they were elevated to a big game animal. And this is kind of a weird misnomer. So what happened for us when we made the bear a big game species from a nuisance species is that prior to that, you could kill a bear at any time, 365, 24/7 for any reason whatsoever, and often will get paid for it. Once it became a big game animal, we very tightly regulated the amount of mortality that would happen. We cut it down to 6 weeks. We regulate what you can wear when you're hunting, what weapon you can use, um, where you can go, how often you can go, how many people can be in a party, um, how many bears can be taken, how often you can go, all of those things tightly regulate. It's a very highly regulated hunt. But since then, that controlled management has allowed the bear population to creep up from about 6,000. And then we kind of peaked at about 25,000 in the late 90s, 2000, or late 90s, early 2000s. We dropped a bit, and now we're kind of sitting at about 17,000 statewide, and it's stable. We have bears entering areas, much to the perhaps annoyance of the suburb crowd, that they haven't been in a century. We have bears pushing out onto the prairies, bears pushing out into the Dakotas, into Iowa, southwestern Wisconsin. So bears are in a wonderful state. Black bears are probably the most um, perhaps widely known, or maybe not, but the most successful conservation story for carnivores that I've found anywhere. They're very highly adaptable. They're generalists. They're very prolific, and so the conservation status for Minnesota black bears, and I think black bears in any place where they occur, um, is in a pretty good spot.
What questions regarding bear management and conservation in Minnesota would you like to see answered in the next 5 years?
Sure. This is a project we're working on. So bears are the species in Minnesota that takes the mammal species at least that takes the longest to have their first litter of cubs. And so from being born until they have their first litter is about 5 years on average in the state. However, we think this has shifted over the last 20 years where on the edge of Bear Range, where the habitat is most productive, because it has agriculture and acorns, which is the most important food for bears in the fall before they den up for winter and give birth, is that the it seems to be shifting to a younger age, which is great for the bear population because it's more productive. They're having cubs at a younger age, and there's more reproductive cycles in a bear's life, so more cubs, more bears in general. But we don't know why. We have some thoughts. It could be from the way that we hunt bears. We allow them to be hunted over bait, and that's to allow for a very clean kill shot, so that there's very little wounding loss, because our woods are so dense. Um, and so it's possible that these baits are actually supplementing the population food-wise, where they are able to carry off pregnancies in natural food failures. And so normally they would reset their reproductive cycle. They would all sync to a 2-year cycle with the red oak acorn crop. But we don't seem to be seeing that anymore. Similarly, there's more corn on the landscape than there ever has been before. The hybrid corn that we are growing, yields are up, that's planted at a tighter density, and so there's more food there. But we don't really know why, and we don't exactly know where the average is anymore. In some of these places, 2 out of every 3 bears are having cubs at 3, which is a big departure from that statewide average. And so I really would like to figure out why.
Hmm. That's really interesting. You've touched on several of our knowledge gaps there on bears in Minnesota. Would you be able to suggest a research topic for a student watching this?
Sure, we have a lot of gaps. I will say we're doing fine for our management. Bears are in a good spot, but the mechanisms for a few things that we're looking for are missing. Um, and similarly, as with a lot of things going on in the ecological world, the climate is changing, habitat is changing, and a lot of the things that we took for granted even 20 years ago probably aren't true, or at least aren't true to the same effect. Um, so one thing that would be a very easy project to do um, is to look at basically just bear diets again. We haven't evaluated this in Minnesota since the late 1980s. Every few years when we have a bad winter, um, deer populations crash because they can't make it through the deep snow, and oftentimes there's a predator blame. And so um, we would probably one of the things we'd like to look at is what are bear diets right now, and how have they changed since the 1980s. In general, it's only 5% of the overall annual diet of a bear that's vertebrates. Usually this is fawns from about mid-May until mid-June. But we don't know if that's still true anymore. Is it possible they're eating them a longer time, or is it a shorter time? The rest of the time they're eating, leaves, flowers, ants, and then berries, of course, when the berries show up, and the nuts, the hard mast, hazelnuts and acorns come fall. And so being able to kind of tease that out, like how many fawns are being consumed by bears, um, what's the overall role on the population, and then just have their diets shifted at all, in the last 30 or 40 years would be a helpful thing for management. Um, if things are the same, that's great. Non-significant, statistically significant results are still important results. It's just a little tougher to publish, but it'd be important for our management for sure.
Right. And Andrew, is there a standard text that new entrants into bear biology should be reading, or is it spread across the scientific journals?
It's spread pretty far across the scientific journals. It's, in fact, very hard to keep up with the state of science right now because there are so many people working on bears across the country and across the world. Um, there is a recent book called Bears of the World, which pulled in species accounts for all the major bear species. And then we have a chapter in there that kind of summarizes what we've learned over the last 40 years or so. Um, but in general, a lot of the foundational papers and monographs are spread across the Bear Journal, which is called Ursus. That's also, aside from a 2-year embargo for what's recently published, everything is free and online at bearbiology.org, going all the way back to the 70s. And then the rest are spread through some journals that are open source and some that are, behind a paywall. Journal of Wildlife Management has a lot of the early papers. And then after that, the explosion of scientific journals, it's just really spread to the winds.
Mhm. So Bear Biology is the website and the home of the journal Ursus.
Yes, it's the professional journal for the International Association for Bear Biology and Management, also IBA for short. You can just Google IBA Bear Biology and you'll come up right to the website. And there's a link up on the upper right-hand side with all those back issues.
Mm. Andrew, what about the conference circuit in Minnesota or elsewhere? Are there any conferences that new entrants into bears should be following?
Yes, so it's a very small world. I know almost all the bear biologists from most of the states in the United States and most of the Canadian provinces. Less so for those that work for the federal government, especially the federal government in Canada, but it's a very small world. And most of the reason why I know these people are from the conferences. And so every 2 to 3 years is the IBA conference, the International Association of Bear Research and Management that I talked about. Um, and then there is a every other or every 3-year rotation set of workshops for the eastern and western parts of North America. And so there's the Eastern Black Bear Management Workshop and the Western Black Bear Management Workshop. And those rotate around the country, but in any given 3-year period, 2 out of those 3 years will have one of those conferences. And there's also one that just happened um, about a week or two ago. I think it was 3 weeks actually, in Kalispell. It moves around as well, but that's the International Meeting on Human Bear Conflict. And so that's less agency people and more just in general people who are interested or work in human bear conflicts and want to learn more techniques and bring it back to their respective communities. Similarly, there's the Wildlife Society meeting that's annual. It moves around. This upcoming year, it'll be in Des Moines, Iowa. Um, but there are bear people there. It just kind of depends on what often as government biologists, we can only pick one conference to go to a year at max, and it depends on funding, of course. The university people are able to go a little more, but most of those will be on that IBA website posted as they go, so people can see what's upcoming. Um, and then there's also other groups that work with other bear species as well. So the IBA work will discuss mostly all of the bears that um, it's primarily brown bear and black bear focused because that's where a lot of the work is on. But there are polar bear people there. There are sun bear, Asiatic black bears, panda bear people there as well. There's also the IUCN Bear Specialist Group. This is a species survival commission of professional biologists, but there is almost one in every single country that has bears, and some in countries that don't have bears. There's a number of UK members as well, uh, as well as in the EU. And so reaching out to some of those people to see what they do, learn what they're doing, that sort of thing, and maybe leverage that network is another good one to meet people at as well. They don't have meetings per se that are open to the public, but they often will have a joint session at those IBA meetings. So if your international work is more of your passion, that's the place to be.
Any of these meetings are held online, Andrew?
Some of them are. It depends on the conference itself. IBA has been online before. Um, and then the proceedings of the big IUCN meeting, the global IUCN meeting is of course online that can be streamed. But most of these are in person. Um, the IBA one is nice because it switches between North and the Americas and Asia and the UK. Or sorry, Asia and Europe. They haven't had a UK IBA meeting, but that would be sweet. But it's at least switches each side of the Atlantic periodically to make things easier for people to travel on those. And so it's a decently spendy meeting if you're an undergraduate or a young person just making it out. But there are often travel grants to attend this conference as well. You just have to look at the deadlines and apply early.
Mhm. Andrew, is there anything you'd like to add?
One career path that I think perhaps not a lot of people think about related to bears is this human bear conflict path. And so I would say, at least for black bears, human bear conflict is the driving force for management decisions. And so being able to get into a situation where perhaps there are attractants available and there's an opportunity to um, reduce those attractants and keep bears wild while keeping property from being damaged. There's a real knack for that type of job, and you don't always have to go through a state agency to have that sort of position. If you have some experience, there are a number of nonprofits that are working on this sort of arena. Carnivores and People, I believe, is one that works out in Montana. There are a number of others, Defenders of Wildlife, that have these early intervention situations where if people like ag producers are having bear problems, they can contact the agency or these organizations, and they will help put up electric fence or um, put up some sort of hazing system in order to keep the bears out and keep their livestock safe. And so if that sounds at all interesting, yes, it's a lot of people management. Yes, it's a lot of dealing with maybe the more controversial side of wildlife management, but that piece of bear biology is expanding every single year. And in general, more people are looking for ways to coexist with bears that do not require lethal management. In general, society is moving away towards that when there's a bear problem. In the 50s here in Minnesota, if you had a bear problem, most of that was solved with a bullet. And it's just not that way anymore. We focus heavily on reducing those attractants, trash, birdseed, that sort of thing. There's a nationwide program. This little guy here is a piece that we hand out. It's a program called Bear Wise, and it's hosted by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And so if you want to make a job for yourself, being able to work with local governments to develop ordinances that prevent people from inadvertently feeding bears, working on contracts for trash haulers, that sort of thing. There's lots of opportunities there that I think is a non-traditional path that people might overlook. And that's, if agencies and governments don't get ahead of the human bear conflict thing, if people are having bear issues and bear conflicts, it's really hard to push a conservation narrative when bears are breaking into your homes or that sort of thing. And so, if you really want to do foster coexistence and deal with bears in a real personal way, that's one option.
That is absolutely fantastic. Andrew, you are the Bear Project leader for the Forest Wildlife Populations and Research Group of Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Thank you so much for being on the Practical Animal channel, Dr. Andrew Try.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.